The night the room went silent. May 1973. Beverly Hills. The crystal ballroom of the Beverly Hills Hotel shimmered like a jewel box sealed off from reality. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across polished marble floors. Tables draped in ivory linen glowed beneath candlelight. Laughter moved from table to table in low, practiced waves, the laughter of people accustomed to being seen. 200 guests, studio executives, directors, actors whose names filled marquees, writers who could command 6 figures for a script, the industry congratulating itself for caring. At the center of it all stood Dean Martin. Dean wore a tuxedo that fit like it had been poured onto him. His hair was immaculate. His expression, relaxed, amused, suggested he would rather be anywhere else. He never liked events like this. Charity, in his mind, it wasn't something you polished under chandeliers. It wasn't something you applauded between dessert and brandy. It was something quieter, something done when no one was looking. But he had come, because sometimes showing up mattered. At a table near the rear of the room sat Marlon Brando. Brando's presence bent attention even when he wasn't speaking. He had that gravity. After The Godfather, he had become something beyond famous. He was mythic. He was considered, by critics, by peers, by himself, a revolutionary. He watched the room with restless detachment, as though observing a species he didn't quite belong to. When Dean's name was announced for a humanitarian recognition, the applause was warm, not explosive, but sincere. Dean walked to the stage unhurried. He accepted the Crystal Award with a small nod. When he leaned into the microphone. "I'm not much for speeches," he said, his voice smooth, easy. "I always think the minute you start talking about helping someone, you turn it into something else." Soft laughter. He continued, "If you're lucky in life, and I've been lucky, you don't owe applause. You owe balance." The room quieted. "Helping someone isn't heroism, it's arithmetic." More applause, this time genuine. And then, a sound broke through it. Slow, deliberate, mocking. Clap, pause, clap, pause. Every head turned. Brando stood at his table. His expression wasn't rage. It wasn't drunkenness. It was something more precise. Disdain sharpened into theater. The applause died. Brando's voice carried effortlessly. "A personality receiving an award for depth," he said. How perfectly Hollywood. Silence collapsed over the room like glass. 200 powerful people suddenly very aware that something unscripted had just begun. Dean did not move for 3 full seconds. His face didn't harden, but something behind his eyes did. He set the Crystal Award down carefully on the podium, adjusted the microphone, and spoke. "Marlon," he said calmly, "I didn't know you were coming. I'd have prepared a better joke." A ripple of nervous laughter, immediately swallowed. Brando did not sit. Dean studied him, not with anger, but with clarity. "You think I'm a hack," Dean continued evenly, "that I don't suffer enough for my craft, that I don't dig deep enough into the human condition." The room tightened. "And maybe you're right. I don't suffer for it. I work. I go home. I sleep." He paused. But here's something I've learned. Depth isn't measured by how much pain you feel inside a character. It's measured by what you do when the lights are off." Brando's jaw flexed. Dean stepped away from the podium. "When a grip breaks his leg and can't pay rent," Dean said, "the role you're playing doesn't matter." He looked around the room, not at Brando. At some point, the question stops being, "How good am I?" His eyes returned to Brando, and starts being, "Who am I when no one's watching?" The air in the ballroom shifted. This was no longer about acting. This was about character. Brando's composure faltered for half a second. Just half. Dean continued, voice still smooth, but now edged in steel. "You're a brilliant actor, maybe the greatest of your generation. I won't argue that." A pause. But brilliance isn't immunity." Another pause. "And talent doesn't excuse indifference." The silence was now electric. Dean picked up the Crystal Award again. "I'll accept this," he said quietly, "not because I deserve applause, but because somewhere out there, someone needs help. And if this room remembers that when the chandeliers turn off, then maybe tonight wasn't just a performance." He stepped away from the microphone. No mic drop, no glare, no raised voice. He simply walked back to his table. For 3 seconds, no one moved. Then one person stood, then another. Within moments, the room erupted into a standing ovation that wasn't for charity. It was for restraint. Brando remained standing, but still. His face had changed. Not angry, not humiliated. Exposed. For the first time in years, perhaps, someone had not challenged his talent. They had challenged his humanity, and that was harder to deflect. That was the night the room went silent. But it was not the night that mattered most. The night that mattered most was the one that followed, when there were no chandeliers, no audience, no applause, just 2 men, and a reckoning. The headlines exploded before sunrise. By 9 in the morning, every entertainment desk in Los Angeles was running some variation of the same story. Dean Martin had stood his ground. Marlon Brando had been confronted. The ballroom had gone silent. Some reporters framed it as a clash of egos. Others framed it as a moral awakening. Most simply called it the most shocking, unscripted moment Hollywood had witnessed in years. But headlines are always louder than truth, and the real story was unfolding in private. Marlon Brando did not sleep that night. He returned to his Mulholland Drive home well past midnight, but the silence of the house felt different than usual. Normally he enjoyed isolation. He cultivated it. It reinforced the mythology that he existed apart from the shallow machinery of celebrity. But that night, solitude did not feel like superiority. It felt like exposure. He poured a drink and did not finish it. Dean's words replayed with unsettling clarity. Not the applause, not the tension. The line that lingered was simple and devastating. Talent doesn't excuse indifference. Brando had spent years believing the opposite. He had constructed an identity around artistic suffering. He believed discipline meant distance. He believed intensity justified detachment. That if he alienated people on set, it was because he was serious. If he dismissed lesser actors, it was because mediocrity bored him. If he refused to socialize, it was because he valued substance over noise. But what if that narrative had been camouflage? What if indifference had simply been easier than engagement? He began mentally reviewing faces he had forgotten. Crew members whose names he never learned, assistants who anticipated his moods, a co-star who once asked him for advice and received only a distracted nod. He remembered her expression more clearly now, not wounded, but dismissed. Dismissal is colder than cruelty. By mid-morning, his agent was calling in a panic. Damage control strategies were suggested, public statements drafted, and carefully worded clarifications about misinterpreted passion. Brando listened without interest. For once, he did not feel misunderstood. He felt understood too clearly. He told his agent he would handle it privately. The following afternoon, he drove himself to Dean Martin's house. There was no press outside the gate, no audience waiting for a sequel. The guard called inside. A pause. Then the gate opened. Dean was sitting by the pool, sunlight reflecting off still water, as though nothing in the world had shifted. He wore a simple polo shirt, no performance in sight. A glass of iced tea rested on the table beside him. When Brando approached, Dean did not stand immediately. He simply observed him, the way a man might observe weather approaching from a distance. Brando noticed something unsettling in that gaze. No triumph. If Dean had wanted to humiliate him, he had already done it publicly. There was no satisfaction in his eyes now, only assessment. Brando spoke first. He did not rehearse it. He did not dramatize it. The words came without armor. He admitted he had confused intensity with importance. He admitted he had mistaken applause for validation. He admitted he had grown so focused on becoming extraordinary that he had neglected the ordinary decencies that sustain human connection. Dean listened without interruption. When Brando finished, there was a long silence, not uncomfortable but weighty. Dean finally said something that would echo through the rest of Brando's life. "You built a mountain," Dean said quietly, "but you forgot to build a door." Brando frowned, slightly confused. "You made yourself unreachable," Dean continued. "Yeah, that protects your genius. It also isolates your humanity." The sentence struck deeper than the confrontation the night before. The ballroom had exposed him publicly. This conversation dissected him privately. Brando asked how to change. The question surprised even him. For decades, he had believed change was for lesser men. Growth implied deficiency. Now deficiency was undeniable. Dean did not offer philosophy. He offered structure. "Come with me tomorrow," he said. "No speeches, no cameras, just show up." The next morning, Brando arrived early at the children's hospital Dean visited weekly. There were no reporters at the entrance, only nurses who greeted Dean by first name. That detail alone unsettled Brando. It meant this was not symbolic, it was habitual. Inside the pediatric ward, and Brando felt something unfamiliar. Helplessness without performance. There were no critics to impress, no scripts to interpret. There were children whose bodies betrayed them, and parents who oscillated between hope and terror in the span of minutes. Dean moved easily through the corridors. He knelt beside beds without theatrics. He asked questions about cartoons and baseball. He remembered birthdays. He brought small gifts that were thoughtful, not extravagant. When a mother cried, he did not offer inspiration. He offered presence. Brando realized he had rarely practiced presence without agenda. At one bedside, a young boy with chemotherapy-thinned hair stared at Brando with quiet recognition. "You're in the movies," the boy whispered. Brando nodded, unsure what to say. Dean leaned in with a grin. "Yeah, but today, he's here to learn from you." The boy smiled faintly. Brando felt something fracture inside him. Not ego, but insulation. Over the following weeks he returned, at first awkward, then gradually less so. He learned to ask about favorite colors instead of diagnoses. He learned that sitting silently could be more valuable than delivering insight. He learned that charity is not transaction, it is continuity. Meanwhile, Hollywood buzzed with speculation about whether the rivalry would reignite. It did not. Something quieter was taking root. Brando began noticing things on film sets he had previously ignored. A lighting technician who limped but never complained, a costume assistant juggling two jobs, a stunt coordinator quietly covering for an injured colleague. He started asking questions. Not for publicity, but for understanding. One afternoon, he learned that a longtime crew member's daughter needed surgery the family could not afford. Old Brando would have dismissed the situation as unfortunate, but outside his jurisdiction. The new version hesitated, then acted. He arranged the funds anonymously. He called personally to ensure it was handled without embarrassment. It did not feel heroic. It felt corrective. Dean did not monitor him. He did not demand updates. But once a week, Brando called, sometimes to ask advice, sometimes simply to report progress. The conversations were brief, rarely sentimental. Dean offered practical guidance. Don't make it about you. Don't rescue people to feel powerful. Help quietly. Stay consistent. Consistency became the discipline Brando never mastered in acting, but now pursued in life. Over time, but something subtle shifted in how people interacted with him. Crew members who once avoided eye contact began greeting him without caution. Directors noticed he was arriving on time. Assistants realized he was learning their names. The change was not dramatic. It was cumulative. Years passed. In interviews, when asked about craft, Brando occasionally redirected the conversation toward responsibility. He never recounted the confrontation in detail. He did not need to. The lesson had matured beyond the event. Dean never publicly revisited that night either. He had not confronted Brando to claim moral superiority. He had confronted him because indifference, when powerful men practice it, spreads like influence. By the time they appeared together at an award ceremony years later, the tension had dissolved into something more interesting than friendship. Respect earned through correction. When Brando thanked Dean privately backstage, Dean brushed it aside with characteristic ease. "You did the work," he said. But both men understood the truth was more layered than that. Redemption rarely begins with applause. It begins with discomfort sustained long enough to produce change. The ballroom confrontation had placed Brando on his knees, symbolically. The hospital visits placed him there in practice, kneeling beside beds, eye level with children, stripped of grandeur. That was the transformation no headline captured. That was the reckoning no audience witnessed. And it would shape the final chapter of both their legacies in ways neither man anticipated. If you would like. And I will now continue with Part 3, The Weight of Legacy, darker, deeper, showing the long-term internal transformation and the ultimate emotional culmination. Or we can expand this Part 2 even further before moving forward. Tell me how you'd like to proceed. Continue with 3-part more unique and lengthy, and also you make sure do not write in small line or small paragraph. Please write in paragraph and not in small lines. Understood. We will continue in fully developed, immersive narrative form, written in sustained paragraphs without fragmented lines, without screenplay formatting, and with deeper psychological weight. This remains dramatic historical fiction inspired by real figures, focused on transformation, legacy, and moral gravity rather than spectacle. Transformation is rarely dramatic after the first fracture. The confrontation in the ballroom had been dramatic. The apology had been dramatic. Even the first visit to the hospital had carried the tension of revelation. But real change, the kind that reshapes a man's interior architecture, happens in repetition. It happens in Tuesday mornings no one photographs and in phone calls no one records. It happens when the adrenaline fades and what remains is choice. For Marlon Brando, the weight of that choice grew heavier as the years passed. He had spent the first half of his life building an identity so formidable that few dared question it. Directors deferred to him. Critics interpreted him generously. Audiences revered him. When you are treated as exceptional long enough, you begin to believe that ordinary moral obligations somehow apply less to you. Brando had never consciously declared himself exempt from decency, but he had lived as if intensity absolved him of it. The myth of the tortured genius can be intoxicating. It allows a man to mistake volatility for depth and distance for integrity. But now that myth had cracked. At first, he tried to compartmentalize the change. Charity could exist alongside ego, he told himself. Compassion did not require dismantling ambition. Yet over time, he discovered that the more he practiced quiet generosity, the less patience he had for the performative suffering he once cultivated. He began noticing how often he used silence as a weapon, how often he withheld warmth to maintain mystique, how frequently he allowed people to orbit him without ever stepping inside his gravity. The awareness was uncomfortable. It required confronting versions of himself he had defended for decades. Dean never lectured him. That was part of what made the transformation durable. There were no sermons about humility. Instead, there were questions. Did you call him back? Did you listen before offering money? Did you show up twice? Dean's emphasis on repetition unsettled Brando more than any rebuke. Showing up once could be theater. Showing up consistently demanded character. On a film set in 1976, Brando caught himself snapping at a young assistant director who miscommunicated a scene adjustment. The room went quiet. The old reflex rose immediately. Withdraw, maintain dominance, allow discomfort to linger. Instead, he paused. He felt the eyes of the crew waiting for the usual pattern. He turned back to the assistant and apologized plainly. No sarcasm. No irony. The moment lasted seconds, but the crew felt it. Power had shifted direction. Small moments accumulate. As the industry evolved through the late 70s, younger actors began citing Brando not only for technique, but for unpredictability. They admired his rebellion. They romanticized his volatility. Brando began to see his own mythology reflected back at him, distorted but seductive. He understood suddenly how easily a legend can reproduce its worst traits through imitation. That realization frightened him more than criticism ever had. He began speaking differently in interviews. When journalists pushed him to discuss genius, he redirected toward responsibility. When asked about artistic suffering, he questioned whether suffering alone produced insight or merely spectacle. Some critics found this shift disappointing. They preferred the inscrutable icon. Growth rarely entertains as effectively as chaos. Dean watched from a distance, rarely commenting publicly, occasionally offering dry observations in private. "You're less interesting now," he once joked over dinner, "but you're better company." The humor carried affection, and Brando understood that was Dean's highest compliment. Yet transformation does not erase consequence. Brando still carried the memory of faces he had dismissed. Some relationships never recovered. Some apologies arrived too late. There were former collaborators who accepted his change cautiously, uncertain whether it would endure. Trust rebuilds slower than reputation collapses. Brando accepted that as part of the debt. The weight of legacy began pressing more urgently as both men aged. They were no longer simply performers. They were institutions. Their choices echoed beyond individual projects. Younger actors studied them. Studios measured risk through their names. Every action now carried symbolic weight. Dean's approach remained steady. He never sought to revise his public image. He never dramatized generosity. He remained outwardly effortless, inwardly deliberate. If he noticed Brando's evolution accelerating, he never claimed credit. Instead, he maintained what had always defined him: consistency without spectacle. In 1980, during a quiet dinner after a benefit event neither of them particularly enjoyed, Brando asked Dean a question that had been forming for years. "Why did you confront me publicly instead of privately?" The question was not accusatory. It was contemplative. Dean considered it carefully before answering, and he explained that some truths, when whispered, are too easily dismissed. Public ego sometimes requires public fracture, but he also admitted something else. He had been angry, not offended by the insult, but angry at what it represented. "You were better than that," he said, "and I hate watching someone waste what they could be." The admission lingered between them. Anger rooted in expectation feels different than anger rooted in insult. It suggests belief. Brando realized then that the humiliation he felt that night had been shaped by something paradoxical: respect. Dean had not dismissed him as hopeless. He had refused to accept his indifference as inevitable. That recognition deepened the weight of gratitude. Years passed. Careers fluctuated. Projects succeeded and failed. Health shifted. The world moved forward with new stars. New scandals, new moral reckonings. But the transformation that began in 1973 did not erode. If anything, it matured. Brando's philanthropic efforts expanded quietly. He funded medical treatments anonymously. He supported housing initiatives for crew families. He intervened discreetly when younger actors faced financial crises. He never attached his name publicly. When confronted about it, he deflected. The irony was not lost on him. The man who once craved artistic immortality found greater fulfillment in anonymity. In the early 1990s, as both men felt time narrowing, conversations grew more reflective. They discussed mortality without drama. Dean remained pragmatic. Brando remained philosophical. But both understood that reputation ossifies after death. The stories people choose to tell become permanent. What do you think they'll say about you?" Brando asked one evening. Dean shrugged lightly. "Depends who's talking." But Brando thought about it long after. When Dean's health declined in the mid-1990s, Brando visited more frequently. Their conversations became quieter, less about correction and more about memory. There was no grand reconciliation needed. That had happened decades earlier. What remained was something sturdier than friendship, a shared understanding of the cost and possibility of change. After Dean's passing, Brando felt a silence heavier than the one in the ballroom years before. That silence carried absence, not tension. He realized that much of his moral calibration had leaned subtly against Dean's steady presence. Without that anchor, he felt exposed again, not to ego, but to responsibility. And the blueprint had been given. Now the maintenance was his alone. At the memorial service, when Brando spoke publicly about the night he had been confronted, he did not dramatize it as humiliation. He framed it as interruption, an interruption of complacency, an interruption of self-mythology, an interruption of the quiet slide into indifference that success can produce. He described Dean not as saintly, but as consistent. He emphasized that what saved him was not a speech, but repetition. Hospital visits, weekly calls, mundane accountability. Redemption, he said, is rarely cinematic. It is procedural. Those words resonated far beyond the ceremony. In the years that followed, Brando continued the charitable structures he had built. When he updated his will to include funding for ongoing support initiatives tied to industry workers in crisis, he did so without announcing it publicly. He understood something now that he once resisted. Legacy is not what you declare, it is what remains operational after you are gone. By the time Brando himself neared the end of his life, the mythology surrounding him had softened. Critics still debated his performances. Scholars still analyzed his technique. But among crew members, assistants, and working families within the industry, a quieter narrative circulated. He was difficult once. Then he changed. And he stayed changed. That final detail mattered, because transformation that fades becomes performance again. The weight of legacy rests not on the moment you fall to your knees, but on what you build after you stand. And in the decades after that silent ballroom confrontation, Marlon Brando built something far less glamorous than artistic legend. He built steadiness. He built presence. He built doors in the mountain he once constructed around himself. And though history would continue to debate who was the greater actor, among those whose lives were quietly altered, the answer to a more important question had already been decided. Who became the greater man? The answer was not defined by applause, nor by awards, nor by the intensity of performance. It was defined by what endured when the chandeliers dimmed and the audience dispersed. It was defined by whether a man chose to remain unreachable or chose to build a door. History remembers confrontation more vividly than correction. It remembers the moment the room went silent far more easily than the years that followed. It remembers the sharp exchange, the public fracture, the visible collapse of ego. But what truly echoes through generations is not humiliation. It is what grows after humility takes root. By the time both men entered the final chapters of their lives, the night at the Beverly Hills ballroom had transformed from scandal into folklore. Young actors whispered about it on studio lots. Agents referenced it carefully when speaking about artistic temperament. Directors cited it as proof that talent without discipline can curdle into isolation. but the story that circulated quietly behind camera trucks and inside makeup trailers carried a different tone. It was not about one man defeating another. It was about one man refusing to let another decay inside his own brilliance. Dean Martin had never sought the role of moral compass. He did not brand himself as righteous. He did not position himself as spiritually superior. He lived with a certain emotional economy that confused many people. He joked easily, moved effortlessly, and rarely appeared shaken. Yet beneath that surface was something sturdy and deliberate. He believed that decency required no announcement. He believed that helping someone did not require reshaping your public identity. He believed that consistency mattered more than intensity. Those beliefs were not philosophical statements. They were habits. Marlon Brando's transformation, by contrast, was turbulent before it became steady. Even after years of deliberate change, and he still wrestled privately with the impulse to withdraw, to retreat into myth, to allow complexity to shield him from accountability. Growth is not a straight line. It loops back on old instincts before advancing. But what distinguished him in the later decades of his life was not perfection. It was persistence. He did not abandon the blueprint Dean had given him when it became inconvenient. He did not revert fully when praise returned. He remained imperfect, but he remained engaged. As the industry shifted into new eras of celebrity, with public relations machinery growing more sophisticated and charity increasingly intertwined with branding, the contrast between performance and presence became sharper. Galas multiplied. Public statements became polished. Social causes became strategic. Against that backdrop, the quiet model Dean had embodied began to feel almost radical. It asked nothing in return. It did not chase optics. It did not monetize compassion. It simply acted. Brando observed this shift with a mixture of sadness and determination. He understood how easily sincerity can be swallowed by spectacle. He also understood how tempting it is to substitute visibility for responsibility. The older he grew, the more deliberate he became about preserving anonymity in his giving. He insisted on privacy clauses. He avoided credit lines. He resisted the urge to narrate his change publicly beyond what was necessary to honor Dean's influence. He knew the ego can re-enter through the back door disguised as transparency. When Dean passed away, something subtle but profound occurred within Hollywood's working class. And it was not the headlines that signaled it. It was the conversations among grips, lighting technicians, junior writers, and production assistants. They spoke of him not as a legend, but as reliable. Reliable in phone calls returned, reliable in checks written without condition, reliable in hospital visits that did not depend on press cycles. In an industry built on instability, reliability becomes sacred. Brando carried that awareness forward. He often returned in memory to the metaphor Dean had offered him years earlier about mountains and doors. He began asking himself whether he had built doors widely enough, whether he had mistaken improved behavior for full access, whether he still intimidated rather than invited. Self-examination became quieter but more continuous. In his later interviews, when asked about greatness, Brando reframed the term carefully. He spoke about the danger of believing talent grants exemption. He spoke about the corrosive effect of worship on the one being worshipped. He spoke about how easy it is to become unreachable while convincing yourself you are misunderstood. Some listeners interpreted these reflections as philosophical maturity. Others sensed they were confessions disguised as commentary. What neither man could fully anticipate was how the story of their confrontation would evolve after their deaths. Stories simplify. They condense complexity into moral lessons. In some retellings, Dean became saintly and Brando villainous. In others, Brando's transformation overshadowed the original fracture. But among those who looked deeper, the story resisted simplification. It was not about virtue versus vice. It was about intervention versus indifference. There is a moment in every powerful person's life when someone chooses whether to challenge them or to flatter them. Flattery preserves comfort. Challenge risks conflict. Dean had chosen challenge, not for spectacle, not for revenge, but because he recognized that indifference in influential men metastasizes outward. The echo of that choice rippled through decades. Brando's final years were quieter. Age diminished physical presence but sharpened reflection. He revisited old films and saw not only craft but arrogance. He reread old interviews and heard defensiveness. He did not despise his former self. He understood him. But understanding did not absolve. It contextualized. In private journals, he reportedly wrote about the necessity of interruption, about how some men require collision to redirect their trajectory. He acknowledged that without that public collision in 1973, he might have continued mistaking admiration for moral substance. When Brando himself died, those who worked behind the scenes remembered him differently than those who only watched his performances. They remembered the calls made quietly, the tuition covered anonymously, the medical expenses erased without fanfare. They remembered a man who once stood unreachable and later chose proximity. That distinction became his truest legacy. The charitable structures he reinforced continued beyond him. Funds remained active. Assistance programs expanded. Beneficiaries often never knew the origin of the support. That anonymity was deliberate. It ensured the work outlived personality. It ensured the echo did not depend on name recognition. Meanwhile, younger generations of actors encountered the story in fragments. Some focused on the confrontation and interpreted it as proof that pride collapses publicly. Others focused on the transformation and interpreted it as proof that growth remains possible regardless of ego. But the deeper lesson remained subtler. The most powerful intervention is one that demands accountability while offering guidance. The ballroom confrontation was remembered because it was dramatic, but the hospital corridors, the weekly phone calls, the decades of consistency, those were the true architecture of change. They proved that humiliation alone does not reform. Structure does, presence does, repetition does. As years turned into decades, the narrative matured into something more universal than Hollywood rivalry. It became a cautionary tale about talent divorced from humanity. It became a meditation on how success can isolate and how isolation can erode empathy. Most importantly, it became an illustration of what happens when someone refuses to let another man remain imprisoned inside his own myth. In the end, neither man's greatest achievement was artistic, though both reshaped entertainment in their own ways. Their most enduring contribution was relational. One confronted without cruelty. The other accepted correction without retreat. Between those two acts, something rare occurred. Pride yielded to growth without annihilating dignity. The chandeliers that illuminated that ballroom in 1973 have long since dimmed. The applause has dissolved into archival memory. But the echo of that night persists, not because of the insult or the applause, but because of what followed. It persists in the quiet acts of kindness that multiplied in its wake. It persists in the reminder that genius without generosity corrodes, and that strength without softness isolates. And perhaps the most powerful echo of all is this: the man who was called a hack did not defend himself by boasting of craft. He defended himself by revealing character. The man who considered himself a genius did not protect his ego by escalating the conflict. He allowed it to break him open. In a world that often celebrates dominance and spectacle, their story endures as something quieter and rarer. It reminds us that redemption is not granted by applause, nor earned through talent, but built slowly through consistent, unseen action. It reminds us that the most significant battles are not waged on stages, but within conscience. And it reminds us that sometimes the greatest performance a person will ever give is the one no one pays to watch, the daily decision to be better than they were yesterday. That is the echo that outlived them both. And that is why the night the room went silent was not the end of a rivalry. It was the beginning of a transformation that continues to resonate long after both voices have faded.